Please note that all attendees today will be muted and the chat and video functions will be disabled. Thank you again for taking the time to join us.
Boker Tov, everyone. My name is Marlene Copeland-Dodenval, and I am the Executive Director in Chicago for the Jewish National Fund. Thank you all for joining us this morning at our annual Chicago Breakfast for Israel. With an opportunity to have such an amazing speaker join us, I'm thrilled that we were able to keep this annual tradition alive. These are unprecedented times, but we are so grateful for technology and for your participation here today. I'd like to give a special shout out to our Jewish National Fund team for helping us today. June Gross, Director of our Center of Excellence, Sarah King, Events Manager, John, Lynn, Ellie, and Nicole. Jewish National Fund has a great team, and because of all of their hard work, we can bring programs like this to you. Should you have any technical difficulties over the next 45 minutes, rest assured that a recording of this program will be sent out by email later today. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our event co-chairs, Bob Wagoda and Gail Eisenberg. Bob is a National Vice President for Jewish National Fund and a past president of the Chicago Board of Directors. Gail Eisenberg has been an active supporter of Jewish National Fund Futures in Chicago. Thank you both for your leadership.
Good morning. I'm proud to be co-chairing this morning's virtual breakfast with Bob. I wish we could all be sharing a bagel with you, but recognize that the imperative of Pekuach Nefesh requires Jewish people to put the preservation of human life above all else, even bagels. Jewish National Fund has been a big part of my life for as long as I can remember. Like the trees we all planted to mark special occasions, my engagement has grown from bringing quarters for the tzedakah box at Bethel Preschool to hosting Lawyers for Israel events. One of my fondest memories of college was traveling to Israel on a JNF Schusterman Foundation leading up north trip on the Israel-Lebanon border. We were planted forests burned down during the rocket attacks and beautified bomb shelters in which families were forced to seek shelter at a moment's notice. Now, my husband, David Eisenberg, and I are proud to introduce our two children, Julia and Hunter, to the Jewish National Fund through family programming, like the ever-popular Community Tu B'Shvat celebration, the annual Rosh Hashanah apple-picking family event, and the JNF Future Windy City Shabbat. Of course, Jewish National Fund is about more than trees. It's about our shared roots in Israel and responsibility to one another. Jewish National Fund is helping to save and enrich lives in Israel today, during the midst of the COVID crisis, and every day. Thank you.
It is my pleasure. Oh. Thank you, Gail. Good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to be serving as co-chair for this morning's event with Gail. Supporting Israel and the work of JNF is a family tradition from our parents and grandparents that Ellen and I have worked to continue, and none of us could have imagined that we would be doing today on Zoom. So even though today's Breakfast for Israel is happening with us apart from one another, it feels so right and what we need to be doing. Gathering people together, even virtually, in support of our organization, our mission, our homeland about which we care so deeply. Thank you to Marlene Dodenville, Executive Director of Chicago, and thanks to each of you for starting your day with us.
Thank you, Bobby, and a beautiful good morning to all of you. I'm thrilled that so many friends of Jewish National Fund and the State of Israel have joined us to hear Matti Friedman this morning. You're in for a rare treat. It's truly mind-boggling that our ancestors were able to endure shtetl life without high-speed internet access. And why didn't anyone have the seichel to copyright the Talmudic chat room? Coincidentally, the story of Jewish National Fund corresponds with the Jewish people's emergence from shtetl life and our yearning to return to our ancient and eternal Eretz Yisrael. The spark emanated from the trial and false conviction of French Jewish Colonel Alfred Dreyfus. It was kismet that an erudite Austro-Hungarian journalist Theodor Herzl, our prophet for a modern millennium, covered the trial and was convinced that Jews needed to return to the land of our ancestors. At the Fifth Jewish Congress held in 1901 in Basel, Switzerland, Herzl electrified the Zionist Congress and his assembled throng by announcing the formation of Jewish National Fund. JNF, or the Eternal Fund, would purchase and cultivate the land in preparation for the ultimate establishment of the Jewish state. Many of you still connect to Jewish National Fund through our planting of over 300 million trees and our work in cultivation and forestation. 20 years ago, on a life-changing trip to Israel for our eldest son's bar mitzvah, we visited the Kinneret, or Sea of Galilee. By life-changing, I mean our son Sam went on to become an IDF soldier, and Lisa and I joined an army of volunteers soldiering on for Jewish National Fund. You see, the Kinneret's water level had fallen to a historic low, as evidenced by a sign next to a diving board that read, "No diving." It should have said, "No water," for there were rocks for hundreds of yards before the water line appeared. Israel had a water crisis, and the organization that literally jumped in first was Jewish National Fund. We set about building over 250 reservoirs, including the 2 funded by Jewish National Fund Chicago in the Heifer Valley. We doggedly pursued the exploration and utilization of a 3rd major aquifer through the Shamir Drill Project. And today, the Kinneret is overflowing, and Israel is providing water to citizens of Jordan and the Palestinian territories. Jewish National Fund is fulfilling the original mission as outlined by our founder, Theodor Herzl, 119 years ago. We are the foundation of the Zionist mission through the 7 pillars of our core foundation. We are community building, pursuing forestry and green innovations, water solutions, and recycling, where we lead the world by a wide margin, technological and environmental research and development, Zionist education and advocacy from grade school through college, preservation of heritage sites of ancient and modern historical significance, and finally, through our support of Israelis with disabilities and special needs. Our path is a holistic endeavor that supports and sustains the Jewish people and the state of Israel. No task is too monumental, no human being inconsequential. Our work preserves and protects the Jewish state for a remarkable people, vulnerable throughout history, but thriving, secure, and strong through the collective efforts of Jewish National Fund and Jews worldwide. You should have just received a text or an email from JNF that makes it easy for you to donate. Or you can go online to jnf.org/donate-CHI-SHI. Please join me and take a moment right now to make a donation. Cue the Jeopardy music. Dun 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 da 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 dun 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 dun. Thank you for being a partner in this work. In times of crisis, we're even more acutely aware that we are our brothers and sisters' keepers. Please join me and my family as we keep the eternal flame that is Israel lit for generations to come. Thank you, and Am Yisrael Chai.
It is now my distinct pleasure to welcome a journalist who has shown great courage and determination in exposing the media's bias against Israel. His writing has been praised around the world, and his books regularly feature on the top 10 bestseller lists. Notably, his latest book, Spies of No Country, explores Israel's first intelligence agents and received the 2018 Natan Book Award. He is also a contributor to the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and other publications. Friends, will you please join me in welcoming the fearless journalist, Matti Friedman.
Thank you so much for having me in Chicago. Virtually, I wish I could be in Chicago for real. I'm speaking to you from Israel, from northern Israel. And usually I have to explain about the differences between life in Israel and life in the diaspora. But at the moment, so many of us are in precisely the same situation. We're all stuck at home looking at screens on Zoom. It's a shame that we have to meet this way, but it's lovely to be with you this morning in Chicago. What I'd like to do in this very brief conversation is look a bit at the gap in perception between the way Israel is viewed from outside Israel and the way it seems to those of us who are here on the ground. I've been a journalist in Israel for my entire adult life. I moved from Toronto when I was 17, that was 1995. And I've been an agricultural worker and a soldier and a university student, but most of the time I've been a journalist, part of that time for the International Press Corps as a correspondent for the AP, the Associated Press, the big American news agency. And I'm just going to try to sketch in this very small window that we have together this morning a few main points on which the perception gap is particularly wide. Points that have come up repeatedly in my conversations with people who take an interest in Israel from abroad. Then that I've noticed that where I've noticed that people's perceptions are very distant from the reality on the ground. And I'm thrilled to be able to talk about this with the JNF audience. Jewish National Fund is very much concerned with reality on the ground, less with kind of amorphous wars about narrative and PR, and much more with the reality of life in this incredible country where I have the honor and luck to have spent most of my life. I'm just going to touch on a few brief points, and then we're going to have time for a few questions. I'll start with one major gap in perception, something that comes up a lot when I meet people in Israel who are coming here for the first time, which is a perception that Israel is a conflict zone or a place where it's unsafe to visit. And this comes up less with JNF groups who have been in Israel numerous times, and more with first-time visitors. Many people have the idea, which is gleaned from press coverage, that Israel is unsafe, and that's because any instance of violence here is covered very heavily, and it gives people the impression that something very big and violent is happening in Israel. I'm just going to unpack that a bit with a few numbers. When I was a correspondent for the Associated Press in Jerusalem, the size of the AP bureau covering Israel was 40 staffers. We had 40 full-time news staffers covering this country. That was between 2006 and the end of 2011. That was my time at the AP. And just to give you a point of comparison, 40 news staffers covering this country is a number dramatically greater than the number we had at that time covering China. Israel is a country of about 9 million people. China is a country of 1.3 billion people. Israel, as a percentage of the world's surface, is 1/100th of 1% of the world's surface. As a percentage of the landmass of the Arab world, it's 1/5 of 1%, 0.2% of the Arab world is Israel. So we're talking about a very small place that is covered very, very heavily, and that gives events in this country a weight in news coverage that isn't really deserved when you look at the actual events in question. And I'll illustrate that with a number. I live in a city of about 900,000 people. That's Jerusalem. Jerusalem happens to be the same size, more or less, as Indianapolis or as Jacksonville, Florida. Those are two kind of small to mid-sized American cities that happen to be the same size as Jerusalem, more or less. And people think that Jerusalem is a city of conflict, really the epicenter of this conflict, which everyone knows, which is called the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If you take the death toll in Jerusalem over the past year, the year that just ended, 2019, And we take every instance of violent death in the city. We take political homicide, we take political violence, terrorism, we take domestic homicide, criminal, anything, any person who died in violent circumstances in the city of Jerusalem in 2019. The number, as far as I can ascertain, because the police won't give you an official number, but the number, as far as I can tell, is 7. So in a city of 900,000 people, there were 7 deaths for any reason in the calendar year 2019. And this is in a city that's covered as if it were the center of a major global conflict. And just to give you a point of comparison, in Indianapolis, which is the same size as Jerusalem, the number of homicides in that same period of time, 2019, was 179. And very few people consider Indianapolis to be a city of war and conflict, although the numbers would seem to indicate that actually it is much more a city of violence than Jerusalem is. Jacksonville, Florida has about 130 homicides every year, and Jerusalem tends to have between 7, which we had last year, and the low 20s. Looking at fatality numbers is a very crass way of comparing different places, and I apologize for doing it. I think it's an incomplete statistic, but I think it's a very telling one, and I think that it's something that is often not pointed out. And often people who take Israel very seriously or take a real interest in Israel for positive reasons, and I think that's probably true of most people on this at this virtual breakfast this morning, often think of Israel as very, very important. And we can sometimes forget that in real terms, Israel is a very small country, and Israel's conflicts are quite small in global terms. And if you rank them on a graph of global conflict, they wouldn't even feature if we take the entire death toll last year in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is covered over time more heavily than any other conflict in the world. When I was an AP correspondent in Jerusalem, there were more reporters in the Jerusalem Bureau than in any other international bureau that was part of the AP. So it was covered more heavily than any other conflict in the world. The death toll last year was about 141, mostly in tragic violence that we had on the border with Gaza. Palestinians were killed in the violence on the border with Gaza last year, and every death is tragic and it should be 0. The number should be 0. So I'm not saying that that number is okay. And I'm also not saying that some of it's not our fault, the fault of the side that I'm on, the Israeli side. But I'm pointing out the scale of things. 141 deaths in 2019 is still lower than the death toll in Indianapolis. And it's about half of the death toll in Baltimore. And if we look at gun deaths in America, it's about 30 people a day in gun deaths, meaning that more people die in gun violence in America in a week than die in this conflict in a year. And that's not the way that it's covered. It's covered as if it were very, very important, when in fact the scale is small. And that's just one part of the perception gap that surprises people when they come to Jerusalem or come to Israel and walk around and don't quite find the conflict that they think exists here. There is a conflict here, of course, but it doesn't play out the way people think. And if you look at other conflicts around the world, it doesn't really measure up. In Syria, over the past 8-9 years, there have been about 500,000 fatalities. And countries in Africa like Congo, the fatalities are in the millions. And Israel is a small place that evokes a lot of emotion, that grabs a lot of attention, but not because of the numbers. It's not because the death toll here is so large that people care about it so deeply. That's one point in the perception gap. Another point that I think is often missed in discussions that I have about Israel is the different meanings that political terminology has in different contexts. And I'm specifically referring to the idea of left and right. When Americans say left and right, they mean one thing. And then often people import those words to Israel and look around in Israel for the left and the right and assume that they are going to find the same thing, that the Israeli left and right more or less corresponds with the American left and right. It doesn't. And people get into a lot of trouble with those terms when they try to understand the state of Israel. The terms right and left in Israel refer to an approach to Israel's conflicts with the Arab world. So if you take an approach that Israel can compromise its way into a better situation, if Israel cedes land, that will allow us to reach a compromise with the Arab world, and that will improve life for Israelis and for our neighbors. That is a left-wing position. if you believe that compromise on Israel's part actually makes things worse by emboldening Israel's enemies and encouraging further violence, then you are on the right. And it almost doesn't matter what you think about other issues. For Israelis, other issues are more minor, far more minor. On most of the red flag issues for Americans, the issues that really animate American voters, the entire Israeli political spectrum would be in the Democratic Party. So Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu, who is a right-wing prime minister by in our terminology, on all of his views on the big issues for Americans, he would be a Democrat. Israel, for example, has free access to abortion. It's not controversial in any way. Not only is access free, it is actually funded by state healthcare, which all Israelis have. All Israelis have healthcare that's paid for by the government. No Israeli citizen does not have healthcare, and that is not controversial. So the right wing does not want to dismantle the public health system, which most Israelis agree works quite well. And in this very strange and tragic spring of COVID-19 and Corona, I think many of us are very grateful for the existence of a public health system, and that does not break down left and right in any way. So I think people need to kind of understand that in foreign countries, their own political terminology doesn't necessarily apply. And when Americans who consider themselves to be on the right look at the Israeli right, I think that if they really understood what the policies of the right are, many people would be quite surprised, I think, at the actual policies in terms of public health, public education, the social welfare net, gun control. Israel has very tight gun control. That's not controversial, and it's not a right-left issue. That's another example of the perception gap or the trouble that people have looking at Israel from the outside and kind of making quick judgments about Israel, thinking that it's a conflict zone when in fact the numbers don't add up, thinking that we have a right-wing government, which we do in our own terminology, but we don't have a right-wing government by American standards. By American standards, the government is actually very much a democratic, a government with policies that would be in line with those of the Democratic Party on almost all of the big issues for Americans. I'm just keeping my eye on the clock here because I don't want to go over. Let me just mention one more point that I think is particularly important, perhaps the most important point for Western observers trying to figure out Israel. Many of us grew up, if you grew up in North America, with a very European story about what Israel is. So it starts with Herzl and pogroms in Europe and socialism, the kibbutz idea, the Holocaust. That is all very much part of the Israel story that we all learned. And the heroes of that story are amazing figures like David Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan. They are the heroes of the founding of the state of Israel. However, if you look at the Jewish population of Israel, you see that only half of the Jews in Israel have roots in Europe, mostly Eastern Europe. And fully half of the Jewish population in Israel has roots in the Islamic world. And that issue is often overlooked. It's not taken seriously enough. And that part of it, the Israeli population, is often seen as a kind of a marginal footnote to Israel's story. But it's not. The existence of a huge population of Jews who are native to the Islamic world, who came from the Middle East, who came from North Africa, that has shaped everything about the country. And you can't understand Israeli politics without knowing that. You can't understand Israeli pop music without knowing that. And you can't understand Israeli cuisine without knowing that. If you come to Israel expecting to find Jewish food, Gail was mentioning bagels before, and if you come to Israel thinking, okay, it's a Jewish country, where are the bagels? You're not going to have much luck finding bagels. You can, but it's not that easy, because what Israelis consider to be Jewish food is actually the food of the Levant and North Africa. People eat couscous and hummus, and they think that that's Jewish. They don't have the Eastern European idea of what Jewish food is because they're not from Eastern Europe. And even the Jews who came to Israel from Europe, from Eastern Europe, the Ashkenazim, have become Middle Easternized over 3 or 4 generations of life in the Middle East. So Israel in 2020 is a Middle Eastern country more than it is a European country. And if you try to see Israel through the lens of Europe or through the lens of European Zionism, you're going to arrive in the country and you're going to be very, very confused about what you find. We need to make a leap to the Middle East and understand that Israel is something completely different. It's amazing. It's troubled in many ways, but it is, in any case, a miracle, and a different kind of miracle than the one that the founders were imagining. I'm going to wrap up, so we'll have a few minutes for questions, and I'll just say that the way to get around the perception gap is not, as some think, to argue about press coverage constantly, and I get a lot of that, and I'm party to much of the criticism of the way the press has covered Israel. I think there's been a major failing in press coverage of Israel, but I think that the way around it is not to get upset about press coverage. It's rather to establish a real connection with the actual country, which means a few things. It can mean getting involved with JNF, which is maybe more than any other organization involved in the realities of life here. Trees are real, water reservoirs are real, the amazing social projects that Jewish National Fund is involved in, those are all real, they're not ideas in press coverage. And the other way to get around it, and I'll end here and then we can take some questions. The other way to get around it, the one that I would recommend, although it is currently impossible, is to come. Just get on a plane and come and spend time in Israel. And a lot of these questions about what is accurate and inaccurate in press coverage will be resolved. Unfortunately, getting on a plane and coming to Israel isn't as easy right now as it was several months ago, but we all hope that within a few months or not too much longer than that, we'll all be able to get on an airplane and move around, and hope that you'll be able to come and visit. And I hope that next time we have this breakfast, it will be in the real world and not on Zoom. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Matti. We all really appreciated those insights, and I think we could have listened for much, much longer. But we did collect some questions in advance from the local leadership here in Chicago that I'd like to pose to you. And the first one is, what are your thoughts on the increase in anti-Semitic and/or anti-Israel trope in connection to the pandemic?
Thank you so much for that question. I have seen some of it. Luckily, because I'm in Israel, I'm in some ways kind of buffered from the worst of it. That was the Zionist idea that we could live in a Jewish state and not have to deal with it. But of course, I keep an eye on what's going on abroad, and it was inevitable. In any time of crisis, a certain number of people, you might even be able to come up with a scientific number based on historical experience, a certain number of people are going to start looking at Jews as a symbol of the problem, as a cause of the problem. And sometimes it's radical people, the people who are always kind of looking for someone to blame, and the Jews are going to be one of those options, of course. And sometimes it's often mainstream people who are actually, smart and not extreme. For example, the mayor of New York tweeted a very problematic tweet about a week ago, in which he called out specifically the Jewish community for congregating during the shutdown. And if you've seen pictures of New York over the past couple of days, there are all kinds of people congregating in the village and different parts of New York. But the community that drew attention is the Jewish community, because the Jews stand out and they end up being a kind of lightning rod for negative sentiment. So if there's some kind of problem, some people are going to identify that problem with Jews. For example, if you are disturbed by the capitalist system, by the banking system, you're unlikely to criticize Swiss bankers or German bankers. Traditionally, the target has been Jewish bankers. And there are many other examples. The example that's closest to my heart, of course, is Israel. People who are concerned with human rights on earth. Of course, I am, and I think we all should be. But you can't escape the impression that people who are concerned with human rights have an inordinate interest in Israel. And in fact, if you look at the world of the left in North America and in Western Europe, you'll see that there's one active boycott currently afoot, and it targets Jews as symbols of human rights violations. And I think that's part of the same mental virus that has afflicted Western civilization for a very long time. Unfortunately, the world is very complicated and kind of unhappy, and it's hard to understand. And so for some people, an easy way of explaining problems, of understanding problems, is always going to be by attaching them to Jews and condemning Jews as being responsible in some way. You're seeing it with the pandemic. You've seen it in the American political scene in different ways over the past couple of years, unfortunately. It's quite upsetting and scary. You've seen it in the way Israel's been treated internationally over the past couple of decades, and it's getting increasingly bad. But this is a historical fact, and I think it's something we're just going to have to live with. It's been around for a long time, and I think it's unlikely to go away.
Thank you. Well, we couldn't not ask you about the new Israel government, given the timing of things and how things have come together. And the question is, what do you think, how do you think the unity government will thrive and or survive? And how might that change the future of Israeli politics?
It's been such a confusing political year that we had 3 elections and no one had any idea what was going on. So it actually took me a second when you asked that question to remember that we have a government that seems to have worked out. I think officially it doesn't exist yet, but it's supposed to exist very soon. There are all kinds of court challenges. The Supreme Court had to rule. Israeli politics is very chaotic and fractious, although the truth is American politics have really caught up in the past couple of years. So I don't know if I need to apologize particularly. I certainly hope that that this government can hold it together. This is a time of major crisis. We're obviously sailing into some very stormy economic waters. We have 1 million people unemployed in a country of 9 million people because of the virus shutdown. I think that there's going to be a lot of fallout from this, and this is no time for another election, a 4th election in the space of a year. We need some kind of stability, even though I personally happen not to be a fan of the Netanyahu government. I have a lot of criticism of his policies, although I respect in many ways his skill in keeping things going and maintaining a status quo that's been good for many Israelis. I think we need a change in government, but I don't think we need it right now. I think we need a period of stability. And I think that we might have one. I don't think it's going to last 4 years, which is the full term of an Israeli government. The governments never make it to the 4-year mark. They always fall apart beforehand. But I think that if we get a year or 2 of economic stability, security stability, that will allow us to get back on our feet. And then I hope we can address some of the deeper political problems that have been kind of floating over the heads of Israelis for a long time.
Thank you. Okay, one more. And I think that this connects to your to the point you made about right and left politics in Israel. If Israel annexes the territory, how do you think this will differ in treatment for the Arabs that are occupied? Is it possible they'll actually be better off?
The question of annexation is one that's been around for a while. It's never really been a realistic possibility because of international opposition. There's a lot of internal opposition. A lot of Israelis think that would be a bad idea. The American administration, the current administration, seems to be signaling that it will accept some kind of annexation, not obviously the whole West Bank, but of parts of it that are heavily settled with Jews. And the question is, will this actually happen? And I tend to be skeptical. There are a lot of issues that seem big and that kind of animate U.S.-Israel ties, but I'm not sure that I'm not sure that it's going to happen in the end, is what I'm trying to say. It might. This is a time of great crisis and the world's attention is focused elsewhere, and Netanyahu and his allies might see it as an opportunity to kind of squeak through policies that would not be acceptable in a normal time. But there's going to be a lot of opposition to it from Europe, from some American politicians, particularly the Democratic Party, and from the Arab world. And Israel has budding ties with the Sunni Arab world, countries like Saudi Arabia and the countries of the Persian Gulf. And those are very valuable beginnings. It's the beginning of something that could be very valuable. And pushback from those directions could lead the Israeli government to say, you know what, this is not worth it. Israel controls the territory anyway, whether it's annexed or not. Does that really matter? I wish that I saw the opportunity for a peaceful 2-state solution in the near future. That would be an ideal solution in my mind. I wish we could have a democratic Palestinian state living alongside Israel in peace and prosperity. That would be ideal. In the Middle East of 2020, that is not a possibility. And if Israel withdrew from that territory, it would not become a democracy. It would become chaotic, like Syria and like other countries in the Middle East have become in the past decade. So our options are limited, and we need a wise political leadership that will keep things from spinning out of control and not make any foolish political moves that play to the political base, a kind of extreme political base and end up making things worse rather than better. And I fear that the annexation move would match that description.
Thank you. I could go on, but I think people need to get to work. It is a work day. So thank you so much for joining us this morning, Matti. And I'm going to now turn it over to the board president for Jewish National Fund in Chicago, Jill Weininger.
Good morning. I'm Jill Weininger, the president of the Chicago Board of Jewish National Fund. And on behalf of the board of directors and our professional staff who are working tirelessly behind the scenes, I want to thank all of you for joining us today and for your continued support of Jewish National Fund. I also want to thank our sponsors and the breakfast chairs and Matti, who all rolled through some quick decision-making to bring this virtual event to you today. We have more events like this coming up this spring, opportunities for you to stay engaged with Jewish National Fund and the people of Israel. May is Women's Giving Month, and all gifts from our women this month will be matched, so the amount that you donate will be doubled. Coming up in late May to celebrate Women's Month, we will have a regional Women for Israel event featuring Lior Lev-Serkars, the author of The Art of Blending. We are also looking forward to upcoming virtual tours of Israel through Jewish National Fund. This is an effort to support Israeli tour guides. You and a group of friends can create a personalized virtual tour of Israel, and the project includes real-time live conversations with our tour guides to learn more about Israel. More information can be found on our website or by reaching out to JNF staff. We cannot wait to have live in-person events with you, our partners, hopefully later in 2020. As we all navigate these uncertain times, one thing remains consistent, and it is that Israel needs us, and the Chicago Jewish community stands in support of Israel. Our commitment to helping Israel continue to grow and thrive is unwavering and anything but virtual. As Scott mentioned earlier, you should have received a text or an email to donate. If you did not, you can still go to this site, jnf.org/donate-shy, to make a donation that will make a difference and help us continue our work. Thank you to all of you for taking time out of your day, and please keep in touch with us via jnf.org to learn more about upcoming events and to support Jewish National Fund's investment in Israel.